In the taxonomy of Tikva gatherings, this is the life and work type gathering. Genus, this is the species Dara horn. We had the species Moshe Halbertal last week. The point of tonight is to get to know Dara, where her biography meets her vocation as a novelist and as a thinker. So I won't spend a lot of time on introduction, but I will spend a little time on introduction. Dara has a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University. Her mentor there, and someone who she's told me is the reason that she got interested in Jewish literature and Yiddish literature and became a novelist, I think you've said even, was Ruth Weiss, who you met earlier in the program. There has several published works which I'm going to list off to you, and not just because I feel obliged to do so, but because they really are fantastic, and every one of them has something tremendous to recommend it. Her first novel that she published is called In the Image, which she published when she was 25 years old, which is unbelievable. It was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award in 2003. Her second novel she published 3 years later, so I guess you were 28-ish, called The World to Come. That's the one I have here, and that I'll read a couple of passages from to set up a couple of my questions. That also won the National Jewish Book Award. They got tired of giving you the National Jewish Book Award. So then her next novel, published when she was 31 in 2009, was called All Other Nights. And we can talk about it. It covers some themes, I think, that are really relevant to some of the stuff what we've studied. All of her novels do. But about America and Judaism. Little known, maybe a little bit more little known, is that you published a nonfiction ebook, right?
Yes.
Last year, called The Rescuer. I haven't read that. Maybe I should. Published by Tablet.
Yes.
And a Kindle bestseller. Why not? And then in 2013, she published her latest novel called A Guide for the Perplexed, which I know has been highly critically acclaimed, and I'm sure it will continue to win awards. There's also a mother of 4 children whose ages range from 9 down to 2, a girl and then 3 boys. And that's all you need to know from me about Dara, so let's start asking Dara about Dara. Maybe we just start, you fill in the narrative for us a little bit. I'm interested in you talking a little bit about what the balance in your life is between your vocation as a novelist and as an academic, or let's just say teacher and researcher, and as a mother. And maybe start back a little bit in your life and how you got to be where you are with that balance of things.
Wow. Well, first I just want to say thank you to everyone at Tikva for inviting me to participate. It's really a privilege to teach all of you incredibly talented people who I'm so unbelievably impressed with in my class and in all of these sessions. So thank you for this opportunity. Your question about sort of scholarship and creative writing, is that
so one dimension is scholarship and creative writing, and then another dimension is personal life and professional life.
Okay.
So maybe take each one in turn.
Okay, sure. So scholarship and creative writing, I will say that in terms of the creative writing side, I think that writing for me and probably for a lot of writers, it's not really like a career choice. It's more like a disease. It's sort of like, you find out you have asthma when you're 5, and then you just have to work your life around the fact that you have asthma. And, it's, I just feel fortunate that I was able to find a way to get paid to do this, because I would have been doing it regardless of whether or not I was getting paid to do it.
I got paid for having asthma when I was little.
Yeah.
In some experimental studies.
Right. You actually were.
It's about you.
That's awesome. I have 3 of my kids have asthma, and I haven't figured that one out yet. I thought about, I always knew I was wanted to be a writer, and as I was in studying in university and college, I was studying Hebrew literature and later studied Yiddish literature, and I can talk about that, but that's a little bit of a different subject. And I basically, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I started applying. I had worked for magazines and newspapers during college. I had worked, I spent all my summers working at, I worked at Time, I worked at Newsweek, I worked at the New Republic. I kind of thought, a way to get paid to be a writer is to be a journalist. And it was only after doing this, for several years that several summers in a row and freelancing during the year that I realized that I wasn't interested in news, which makes it really hard to be a journalist. So that was very limiting. And when I was graduating from college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to do it. And I applied for many jobs, and the best thing that I ended up getting was a scholarship to spend a year at Cambridge University in England. It was one of these things where they gave you like a room in some medieval college, and they like were throwing money at you, like it was ridiculous kind of thing. Like I don't know who funds stuff like this, but somebody did, and it was this kind of like great opportunity. The problem was that I got engaged like about a month before I won this scholarship, and to somebody who had a job in the United States who wasn't going to be able to come with me, and so I thought, I should turn it down and get married. And I thought, I don't want to wonder the rest of my life what would have happened if I went to England. So I postponed the wedding by a year, and I went to England, and I just was so miserable and completely hated it, and I was so lonely. And while I was there, I did a master's in Hebrew literature. Cambridge, England, not a great place to do a master's in Hebrew literature, but I did. And while I was there, I had a lot of time on my hands because I had no social life. I wasn't interested in drinking beer in a pub and watching people go nuts about football games or whatever they was. So I had a lot of time, and so that's when I started writing the first novel. Mm-hmm. And I wrote the first novel that year. I came back to the United States. I sold it. But at that point, I realized that I wanted to continue studying in Jewish literature, and so I started doing both. And so I started writing the second novel while I was doing the doctorate. And the way I was able to do that is because no one ever thinks the great thing about a doctorate is no one thinks you're going to finish it.
You're writing the world.
The world to come, yeah. So nobody expects you to finish it. Right. So there's you can sort of perpetually be working on a doctorate. Not really, but they give you 9 years. So I thought, I would be working on the novel and I'd be working on the dissertation. And whenever I would get stuck with one, I'd be like, I'm going to procrastinate by writing the dissertation. And then I'd get stuck with the dissertation. I'm going to procrastinate by writing the novel. So I managed to do both without ever feeling like I was really working. Mm. I always felt like I was avoiding work. So, but these two things are not totally unrelated. It's not like I was doing a PhD in Yiddish literature and I was writing a romance novel. The characters started to overlap. So, for example, there's a character in this novel, The World to Come, who's a Yiddish novelist. He's a character in my novel, but I was writing a chapter about him on my dissertation. So it was sort of, one was feeding the other. And so I started to sort of not really see them as separate. And I still don't really see them as separate. I sort of feel that I'm studying literature and I'm writing literature, and I see them as, and there's this weird idea in American creative writing circles that those two things are somehow opposed, and you're going to corrupt your own creativity by studying other works, and I think actually the opposite is true. I mean, you were inspired by literature to create literature. Books come from other books, and that's been very true for my work. So I don't know how sufficient that answer is to your question. But then the question about parenthood.
Then maybe you could talk about balancing being a very successful novelist and getting the phone call from Tikva every once in a while to teach. And I should also mention that there's going to be filling in at Harvard next fall, teaching a course at Harvard in Jewish literature next fall. And you have 4 children and they're devoted mothers, so I'm curious as how has that impacted your writing?
Well, I don't sleep a lot, if that's the question. I will say that I did have the advantage of, let me back up to say it this way in terms of a work-life question. My mother has a doctorate in Jewish studies, and she was a public school teacher, and then she did the doctorate while I'm one of 4 siblings, and while the 4 of us were very young, she did her doctorate. And because she did it that way, she was never, she felt that she was not able to do all the publication and the teaching and all the things you needed to continue an academic career. And she worked in a bunch of different jobs after the PhD, but ultimately she went back to being a public school teacher. And it was as if she had never done the PhD, and it was sort of a very devastating thing for her. And so I was very, very worried about as a woman, having children derail my career. When I got married, I told my husband I wasn't going to have children until I published my first book, which fortunately for us happened quite quickly, and I published when I was 25. I don't know if I would have held on to that if I was like 38 and hadn't published a book. I probably would have changed my mind at some point if things had worked out differently. But I was very concerned about finishing the doctorate and getting the books published and everything like that before I had children, and I was married like about 5 or 6 years before I had children because of that, because I was very afraid. Since then, as my children have been born, it is very challenging. I will say that it's also, I feel it's of all the professions I could be in as a parent of young children, it's actually one of the more flexible ones, in that I in terms of like the way my day works, I usually am writing while my children are in school, and then when they come home, it's like I'm home and I'm with them, and they don't really know that like they don't know or care like what I'm doing during the day. So that's been convenient for me, and I've found that for the most part, I'm able to make my own hours. It becomes difficult when I do a lot of touring when the books come out, and so that's difficult for my family. But it's I think it's a challenge that any parent of young children has. Like really, and there's almost any job, there's going to be those kinds of conflicts, and people get disappointed, and they learn about the disappointments of life. It's like you think that's like one of your lessons you're teaching them as a parent.
I guess that addresses the practical side. I mean, what about the creative side? Has it helped you in thinking up stories and plots and ideas, or has it inspired you in what you've written?
Not really. Well, I'll say like I'm not, I'm not a very autobiographical writer. I think for a lot of people that would be true. People who really are drawing on people they know in their life as building characters out of the people they know. Yeah. I'm really not doing that. I'm really my characters are imaginative creations. They're not based on people I know. The only thing I would say about that is, my attitudes toward life change with my children. And I think that's true not just with having children, but like in any, as you get older, your attitudes toward life change. And I think that you see that in the writing. I think that you can see that in probably any novelist writing who's produced a body of work over a number of years. You see an evolution you can see the person age, right? I mean, you often see the characters age. You often have people who their characters kind of are approximately the same generation as that they are, and their characters age over the years. You see that with like somebody like Philip Roth, who writes about young people, and then years pass and he writes about old people. But I think that so in that sense, I think my books have changed, and in terms of creativity. But I will say that I feel very fortunate because I feel that I'm able to have I have an imaginative life that has nothing to do with my real life. And it's sort of, I have an ability to have a life that has nothing to do with all of the people I see every day, which in a lot of ways is kind of a refuge from the people I see every day, which is nice. So I think that, the creativity has been, I don't think that my children have either limited or inspired my creativity. There are a lot of things I do with my children that are sort of creative things I do while I'm raising them, but I'm not convinced that those things have to do with me being a writer. I think that's just things that I do with my children, and like I'm doing science experiments at dinner or something like that. Those are things that I would do probably regardless of what job I had.
As I've expressed, I'm very fond of your novels, and this one in particular sticks with me. I won't ruin it for everybody. I won't ruin the plot, but suffice to say, as you've already heard, a Yiddish writer, Der Nister, which means the hidden one, yes, is one of the characters in the novel, as is Marc Chagall. And that's one plot that's being weaved in together with a plot that's more contemporary about an art heist and just Soviet Jewry in Vietnam and a lot of interesting things. But I wanted to read one bit here to set up the question that I'd like to ask next. So this is the very beginning of chapter 8. And this is part of the novel that's focusing on an encounter of Der Nister and Marc Chagall. The hand that dents each child's face below the nose just before he is born, Der Nister had once learned, is a familiar one. The day before the child's birth, the very same hand scoops up the child and takes him on a tour all over the world, from morning until evening, showing him everything he will ever see, the place where he will be born, the places where he will live, the places where he will travel, and at the end of the long day, as the dusk slips between the fingers of the hand, the places where he will die and be buried. The child sees all this in a single day. The owner of the hand reminds the child that against his will he was created, and against his will he will be born, and against his will he will live, and against his will he will die. And against his will he will someday have to give a full and complete accounting of everything he has done with all that was given to him against his will. And the child is frightened, not of dying, but of living. He goes on. So, you didn't make that up.
No, I didn't make that up.
That's actually...
No, it's from Nida.
and that's actually from Pirkei Avot. I mean, against your will you were born,
yes.
Against your will you'll live.
And the whole passage, with the image of the child before it's born being shown, the places where it's going to be born and live and die, is from Bavli Nida, and from... There's a few different places where this legend appears. One is in the Talmud, and Nida, and I'm going to forget the page. That's probably the most detailed version of it. And then there's another version of it in I think it's in Tanchuma, in Midrash Tanchuma, and then there's another place. I think it's in this was 10 years ago I wrote this book, but maybe Sefer HaChasidim.
Right.
But this is this is the height of unoriginality, in fact.
Well, I mean, that's actually quite original, and this is what I want to ask you about. I mean, you take this material and you weave it so eloquently into a story, and I've heard you talk before about the way that what you aspire to do with English is to make it into a Jewish language. So maybe in light of what we've read, and I mean, I'll just say that one of the things that reading your prose makes me want to do is it makes me want to be more erudite Jewishly. Like just everything that you just said. Like I think to myself, if I could pick up on all of those things, it would open up layers of meaning for this. So I have a feeling that that's what you refer to when you talk about writing English as a Jewish language, but maybe you could just unpack that concept.
Sure. It's funny what you said, that it makes you want to be more erudite. We were talking in the last session about gateways into Judaism. There was some interview with me that they did for, not this book, but another book, my book, Guide for the Perplexed, where they said, the person who was writing this article, it was for some Jewish paper in California, and they said, Dara Horn's books are kind of like a gateway drug for Judaism, right? Which I was sort of thinking like I'm like marijuana, and Maimonides is like crystal meth. Right? It's a great image, right? I was a little bit put off by this idea, but what you say is, and I have said this often, that I want to write in English as though English were a Jewish language. When I was talking about the beginnings of my work earlier, I was sort of just talking in pragmatic terms about logistically where I was, how I had the opportunity to write these books. But creatively, I was studying Agnon, the Hebrew writer Shai Agnon, and how he's writing these sort of modern stories, which are at least some secular, at least in some way, or sort of at least not traditionally religious in some way, but the language is completely immersed in this religious world and is drawn from this religious world. And he's not the only writer who does that. It really many Yiddish and Hebrew writers of the early modern period were doing this, where you have someone like Shalom Aleichem who's writing modern stories, but there's sort of these constant ironic references, not always ironic, constant references to Jewish religious sources, to the Tanakh, to the Torah, to the Siddur, to the Talmud, and it's just part of the language of the work. And I think that there's in the last session people were talking about American Judaism and some failures of American Judaism, and I would say one thing that is there's a cost of one thing that American Judaism is very unusual in Jewish history, not unique, but unusual, in that this is one of the largest communities in Jewish communities in world history, but this is a community that doesn't primarily use a Jewish language. This is a community that primarily uses English. And we can sort of have all these debates in a place like Tikva about, should we have some kind of funding for, Hebrew studies, or maybe we shouldn't, or what should we do? And, there's a place for that conversation, but what I wanted to do was to write in English as though English were a Jewish language. And what I mean by that, and so because sort of not because I'm meeting people where they are or whatever, but just like, I'm living in a reality where I'm writing in English, and everybody around me is speaking English, And this is the language of the Jewish community. And I wanted to sort of elevate that language to the point where I was going to be able to write in English as though English were a Jewish language. And what I mean by that is not that I was going to write a book that had a lot of words in italics, right? That were like, with a little footnote saying what it means. That was not of interest to me, but that I was going to write books where the language of the story is drawn from these religious sources in such a way that not every reader is going to immediately know where it's from. The more important references are going to be explained, but that it was going to introduce people to these stories, but to not like sit there and explain to everybody what everything was, but to sort of embed those explanations within the text. So that this is the book that you're holding, The World to Come, is an example of that, where there are a lot of actually stories. This is not a religious example, but stories from Yiddish literature that I've built into the plot of that book in such a way that the reader who's reading the book doesn't immediately know where they're from, but later finds out. The titles of my books are examples of that, right? I mean, if you have a book called A Guide for the Perplexed, probably everybody in this room is going to recognize that as like a Jewish title, but I will tell you that most readers will be more like my taxi driver last week, who, and I was taking me to the airport for some event, and he said, I wrote a novel. What's your book called? It's called A Guide for the Perplexed. He's like, that sounds like an amazing self-help book that I would totally buy. And I'm like, if I could capture the self-help market, I mean, that would be great for my sales. Right, work for Maimonides. Right, and then people will say, like, isn't this like a copyright problem? I'm like, well, I haven't yet been sued by the Maimonides estate, right? That hasn't been a problem for me. But these are titles like, other title like All Other Nights. All these are titles that are evocative for a person who has a certain education is going to immediately know that this is a Jewish title. But those who don't have that education are going to find out what this means in the course of reading the book, and so they're going to be introduced to these sources. So most of them I explain, half of them I explain, half of them I don't, and not every reader is going to recognize every reference. But I feel like if I'm reading a novel by Salman Rushdie, I'm not sitting here waiting for the footnotes for him to explain, like, what's Ramadan. It's like, if I really care what Ramadan is, I'm going to go look it up. And otherwise, I'm going to kind of go with the flow and, like, see what people are doing during Ramadan. Do you know what I'm saying? So I feel like that's, and I wanted that to be the atmosphere. I didn't want it to be like, I think there's a lot of American Jewish fiction that takes this sort of anthropological view where they're sitting there and explaining to you everything about, like, why is she covering her hair? And it's like, I don't need to, like, wait for the footnotes for this. And I wanted to really find a way to invite readers into a world.
So this is where this may be a challenging question. I hope not insulting. But I love these novels, as I've said, and I mean it. And I was talking to I would say my brother-in-law, but he's not my brother-in-law, he's my wife's sister's boyfriend, who was reading a novel, and I love him. And he was reading fiction, and I wanted to make a recommendation. I said, I got a great recommendation for you. And then I stopped short, and I thought, wait a second, he's not Jewish. Like, this might not really work for him. Like, he might, so do you feel like there's a sort of a accessibility to your novels to people on whom these references are entirely missed? Or do you feel like the dimension of the novel that they're missing is sort of an add-on, icing on the cake?
I used to think that mattered. When I first published these novels, let me tell you a few things. First, I would say that when you write a novel, it's like you write one book. But then when you publish it, it's like everyone's reading a different book from the book that you wrote, which is actually usually a good thing because they're usually reading a better book than the book you wrote. And when I wrote the first book, this is a book that's as is the one that it sounds like you've read, but all of my books are very, very deeply involved in these themes from Jewish literature, Jewish religion and culture. And to the extent that I thought anybody was going to read it other than my mom, I thought, like, this is a book for a Jewish audience. And when I sold the book, the first time I ever spoke with my editor, who actually has been the editor for all of my novels, the editor is the person at the publishing house who makes the decision to buy the book. She is not Jewish. And the first time I ever spoke to her was on the phone during the contract negotiation. I asked her what her background was. And what I meant by that question was, what's your background in publishing? Mm-hmm. Like, have you mostly published fiction, nonfiction? How long have you been at this publishing house? And I always remember this. She paused on the phone for a minute. She says, well, I'm Italian American. I'm a lapsed Roman Catholic. And I'm thinking, like, so embarrassed, like, how does she think this is what I asked her? And she said, I read this book, and I felt like I was reading about my own life and my own family. And I was like, how the heck did that happen? And, I didn't say it that way, but she said, being Italian American, she said, feeling like I'm from this culture that has like made these enormous contributions to Western civilization and like in art and music and literature, and but feeling like as an Italian American, it's like I'm separated from that culture by a language I don't speak, by a country I don't live in, and that all of the sort of residue of that culture that's in this country is sort of just these kitschy stereotypes. It's sort of like the lowest common denominator of that culture. It's sort of like a caricature of itself. But and wanting to reclaim that majesty of that culture, but feeling like it just wasn't accessible to me. She said, or feeling like being a lapsed Roman Catholic, feeling like I'm part of this beautiful religious tradition that has been infused meaning in so many hundreds of generations, and maybe not hundreds, but whatever, how many generations of people's lives, and but that I feel like I can't fully embrace it as a modern person, but it has this enormously long shadow, and I don't really want to give it up either. So I just felt like I was reading about my own life, and I will say that I've been very surprised by how widely my books have been embraced by audiences beyond Jewish readers. I get a lot of mail from religious Christian readers. I get invited to speak at Christian colleges and at these kinds of Christian literary conferences and things like that. Because I will say, actually, Christian readers know the Bible. The Jewish readers do not know the Bible. Christian readers, and I have a lot of Christian readers who very love my books. They feel like this, this is about, for them, this is about Scripture. Right, this is about, they see this as sort of an engagement with Scripture. My books are translated into many languages. Like, I don't think, a lot of my Norwegian readers are Jews. I mean, I'm sure there are some Norwegian Jews who are reading my book, but, that doesn't really account for Norwegian translation of my book. So I feel that, I underestimated my readership by not appreciating that literature is about communication, right? I mean, it's about sharing an experience with someone who hasn't had that experience, and that was something that I didn't fully appreciate. So I will say that, and that's the answer that I give when I get asked this question, in Barnes and Noble. But I will say also that this works. Okay, I will say also that. That those readers I do feel are missing something. There is an additional layer of, and I wouldn't even say it's necessarily Jewish versus non-Jewish. It's more like people with an education in Jewish texts, right? Which obviously includes people who aren't Jewish in some cases, not very many, but some cases, and also certainly doesn't include all Jews. But it for people who have an education in Jewish texts, they will appreciate a lot more of what I'm doing, or are better situated to appreciate what I'm doing. But what I've also found is that I do feel like I have underestimated my readership in thinking that these really were just books for a Jewish audience.
Interesting. So let me ask another question I set up with a little short reading. A little earlier than the passage that I read before, you fictionalize the encounter of Der Nister, the Yiddish poet, with his hero, I.L. Peretz.
Yes.
Actually spoke to our class this morning about this, and I hadn't realized that the historical encounter of these two that Der Nister writes about in his journals, I guess?
Yeah. It's actually an essay that he published about meeting Peretz.
Meeting Peretz.
Yeah.
It was actually very close to how you written it. So you really
lifted it.
You really did rip it off.
Yes.
Okay. So Der Nister has this audience with this man that's basically his Rebbe and that he idolizes so much. And this is what you have Peretz say to him. What's remarkable about your work is the bridge you build between good and evil, Peretz was saying when Der Nister finally listened. Most people don't believe in evil. For them, every act of cruelty is just a misunderstanding. And if we only understand the motives behind it, we could eliminate the motives and make it disappear. I believed that too when I was young. Smoke leaked between the writer's lips. I was a lawyer, you know. Der Nister knew, of course. The lost souls in Peretz's stories often found themselves being judged in front of a divine tribunal, and usually the prosecutor had the last word. In a way, I'm sorry that you don't still believe it, Peretz said. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his cigarette on a plate next to the table. You know about the irrationality of evil and the humanity of it. It's in everything you write, and it's necessary. Darnister allowed himself to smile, but the smile proved premature. But you are too indulgent, Peretz declared, waving his hand to brush away the smoke ring along with Darnister's ego. You are seduced by beauty, and you think that if you can write a pretty sentence about something, then it doesn't matter where the story goes or how it ends. Your greatest weakness is that you write as if you were painting a picture instead of telling a story. A painting doesn't have to mean anything, but a story does. And this idea that gets planted in Darnister's mind that a story has to mean something, where a painting doesn't, becomes this obsession of his throughout it. And a little bit later, when he's encountering Marc Chagall, he asks Chagall, by the way, I mean, I'm going to paraphrase it. By the way, you know, Marc, what do your paintings mean? And Chagall gives him this dismissive answer. It means blue. And then when he presses Chagall further, Chagall says, what does your daughter mean? And then that becomes this obsession of Darnister's. And he says, the hidden one bit his lip. He thought of Hodel, that's his daughter, almost 8 years old and already brilliant, solving puzzles, writing full sentences in 3 languages, ready to take over the world. For an instant, his imagination simulated the brush of her hair against his wrist. Did gifts from God have the right to be meaningless? But she does mean something, he heard himself say. She means the future. Someday she'll light a candle for me on the anniversary of my death, and her grandchildren will be given my name. And what if they're not? That's Chagall's answer. Okay, so writing has to mean something. So here's the question. What do your novels mean?
Well, I want to say something about poor Hodel before we did, but well, I don't want to give anything away.
So the easy way into this, the easy way into this very difficult and weird question is, what have your novels been taken to mean by your readers? I mean, in other words, your readers are reading them, interpreting them. You probably get wind back from them of like how they interpret them, and sometimes that aligns with what you intended, and sometimes it doesn't. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But also, like to hear you reflect on what. You raised the child.
Yes, I did.
The writer has to have to mean something.
Yes, and I do get frustrated with writers who avoid the question, as many Jewish writers famously do too. I mean, like Bashevis, Isaac Bashevis Singer would famously sort of like retreat into art for art's sake, like whenever it was like not convenient for him to give an answer. And that's one of the things I really loathe about him. So we're teaching his work tomorrow. So I think that. I would answer this in a few ways. In terms of what readers have taken it to mean, as I said, you write one book, but people read a different book from the book you're reading, and they find things in them that you would never have expected. One example, you never would have. I mean, there's things people have found in my books that I just surprised me very much. Like, I'll give one sort of very easy, concrete example. This book, All Other Nights, which takes place during the American Civil War. It's a spy novel. It's about Jewish spies in the American Civil War for the North and the South, and they're based on real historic figures. There's one major, without giving anything away, there's a major character who's injured during this war. And that's it's something that happens in the book, and it's like a plot point. It turns certain things happen because this person gets injured. Certain things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. From my point of view, while I was writing the book, this was like a plot point, and it had symbolic significance as well. But it was a plot point. A few months after the book came out, I got a call from somebody from some foundation for reading groups. And they were starting a program to read this book in Walter Reed Hospital, which is where wounded American Army veterans were being taken during the Iraq War. And because this person said, this is a book about a wounded war veteran. And I was like, it is? I'm like, it is, but I had not conceptualized it in that way. But that doesn't mean that reading was wrong. There's really only happened once or twice where a reader came to me and said something that I truly thought was like just dumb or wrong. It does happen occasionally. There's one reader who wrote to me and said, I was reading this book, this is in The World to Come, until, I was really enjoying it until I got to the point, about 40 pages in, there's a scene where somebody's beating a horse, and how could you treat an animal so cruelly? And then I said, they're like, I think that literature should be uplifting, and we should emphasize, the good in the world. And I'm like, well, maybe you should be reading, Garfield comics. Because, you should definitely avoid the Bible, because there's a lot of, especially, if you read the Gospel, there's this bloody part with the person being nailed to some boards. If gore is a problem for you, this is not a book for you. Stick with Garfield and Friends. So there's always going to be people who don't get it. There's other issues, actually the German translations of my novels. I've found some problematic interpretations of my novels in that audience. But I will say that, to not just avoid your question, my books, what do my books mean? I have found that a lot of the things that were discussed in the last session about American Judaism's failures, this was the world I grew up in. And, when everybody's telling you your life and your culture are a fake and a failure, it's very annoying. And it's annoying because it's sort of you're sitting around talking about how something's a fake and a failure, and the thing that you're talking about that's a fake and a failure has been here for 350 years and involves 7 million people. And so, I just sort of always thought that was ridiculous. And I felt that I wanted to sort of demonstrate that reality. I wanted there to be... I was looking to create an American Jewish culture that was equal to American Jews, who are, such a, tremendously educated, if not always in Judaism, but tremendously educated, tremendously inquisitive, tremendously ambitious people. And I wanted to sort of, to write, to in the process of writing these books, create a culture, in a sense, some of which already kind of existed and some of which did not. And so that's part of it. And then part of it is also, I think that there's, one of the things that was mentioned in the last session was this idea of return. I actually think that this, I don't think that that's something that's new. I think that you have this theme of return is always in Jewish life, is this idea of recovering the lost book. This is a motif that goes back to King Josiah, right? Melech Yoshiyahu, where they find they're cleaning up the Beit HaMikdash, right? They're cleaning up the temple, renovating the temple, and suddenly, they find a scroll, and they're like, what is this scroll? They're like, oh, it's the Torah, right? It's Deuteronomy or whatever. They're like, it's the Torah. They're like, look, it's got all these things in it, about stuff we should be doing. Maybe we should do it, right? I feel like this is something that happens in Jewish life, over and over and over again. It's always oh my God, look, these people in the olden days, they really had it the right way, and what are we thinking? But that was true even in the Tanakh. It's in the book of Judges, it's oh, they sin against God and they go back again, they sin against God and they go back again. It's it's this perpetual cycle of losing this true connection with God and then regaining it again. And so my novels are sort of questioning that whole cycle, and sort of asking the question of whether perhaps the cycle itself is the tradition. It's not that we keep returning to tradition, but rather that the cycle is the tradition. The cycle of rejecting it and then bringing it back again, and rejecting it and bringing it back again. The opening, one of the sort of, not the opening, but one of the critical or sort of fun, pivotal scenes in my first novel, in The Image, was based on a story that I heard from a friend who said that when his it was a story he heard from his great-grandfather, and he said that when his great-grandfather came to the United States at the turn of the 20th century, he came on a ship carrying many Jewish immigrants, and when the ship came to New York Harbor, all these Jewish immigrants went up on the deck to see the Statue of Liberty, to see the new city, and when my friend's great-grandfather went up on the deck, he said that people weren't just looking at the city, they were throwing something into the water, and when he looked closer, he saw that what these people were doing was they were throwing their tefillin overboard, because they felt that tefillin was something from the old world, and here in the new world they weren't going to need it anymore. And my friend's great-grandfather said to my friend and his family that, I want you to become a deep-sea diver, to go down to the bottom of New York Harbor and bring these tefillin back to dry land. I will say that after I heard this story, I would repeat it to people I knew, and I found that people 75 and older were all like, yeah, I heard this before, that the fill-in in the harbor. And, yeah. So, and then I discovered it. Later I found a Yiddish poem by an American Yiddish poet that's about this story. So this was like a thing. This was like a popular legend.
And didn't you write like a debunking thing about it in Azure or something?
Yeah, well, no, a debunking thing about my name was changed at Ellis Island.
Okay.
Yeah, that I've written about. I've written a few places about that. In Mosaic also I wrote about that. About there's a perennial American Jewish legend about how my family's name was changed at Ellis Island. If any of you feel like this it didn't happen. It never happened. Nobody's name was ever changed at Ellis Island. So again, we can talk about that another time. So these are American Jewish legends, and I think that the American Jewish community is always worried about authenticity. Sort of there's this idea that like our lives here are somehow inauthentic, and that this is just this pale reflection of like this real Jewish life that happened in like some old country somewhere. But the reality is a few things. First of all, in that old country somewhere, they also were feeling like their life was just a pale reflection of the real Jewish life, what was happening in the old country, which was wherever the place that they came from before that, right? I mean, this is an ongoing thing. It goes back to like King Josiah, right? I mean, this is a perennial problem, first of all. But second of all, the idea that, this was just, I felt that this was just false, that like, this idea that what's inauthentic about American Judaism is a 350-year-old community that has its own traditions, that has its own institutions. And so I wanted to sort of create a meaning to that. So that's sort of like the more sort of national meaning of my books, is to sort of create this culture, or sort of create an expression of this culture, or to sort of shape it in the process of creating these works of art. So that's sort of the national or cultural meaning of them. But in terms of what interests me as an artist, it's a related question, which is the question of memory versus history. And how the way we remember things is itself a creative act. And all of my novels are sort of dealing with that question, a few questions. One is the question of memory, how the way we choose to remember something is how it defines our present. Right? The way we choose to remember the past is how we define the present. So that's one thing that all of my books have explored. And the other thing is really and this is perhaps something that's in line with a lot of things we've been discussing this week in the various institutes, but which is about the limits of human creativity. All of my novels are about creative people who somehow run up against a wall. So the first novel is about a photographer who ends up losing all of his entire collection of photographs of a lifetime to give something away. It's okay, it's not a big plot point. The second novel is about artists, but it's ultimately about art forgers and art thieves. My third novel is about spies, but it's really about there's characters in it who are actors, and so it's about performance and who we pretend to be and who we present ourselves to the world as versus who we really are. And my last novel is about a software developer, and sort of who wants to create this like app that helps you it's an app that records everything you ever do. So it's this attempt at perfect memory, and ultimately the book ends up being about the limitations of that quest. So in that sense, in light of other Tikva sessions, this is sort of we often in this institution people talk about Judaism as sort of like as an alternative to modern Western secular life, and the point where my novels sort of echo that idea of these two things being separate is. I think that in Western secular life, there's this idea of the primacy of creativity and human potential is sort of limitless. And all my novels are sort of about the limitations of human creativity. So that's what my novels mean.
I knew that sounded. I have more questions, but I know that a lot of you are invested in these novels as I am, so I'd like to give people a chance to ask their questions. Itzy.
Okay, I wanted to ask just a little bit.
The mic.
Sorry. Yeah. Do I have to stand? I wanted to ask a little bit about the optics. You spoke about
the what?
The optics of how this plays out. I'll explain.
Okay. I'm like, is that a term that I should know? Understand?
I didn't read any of
Okay.
your books, not because.
Yeah, I'm not offended.
Interest. I didn't know. But I'm gonna go right.
It means you're a new customer.
I'm going straight to Barnes & Noble. No, I wanted to. You spoke. Or rather, Alan spoke about how you have a lot of Talmudic or biblical elements that are sort of slipped into your book. And I was wondering how it looks when you're writing in the afternoon when your kids are at school. Do you have all these like Gemaras open around you and Tanhuma? Do you look for these texts, or are they just things that are so ingrained in your mind that they just sort of flow into the pages?
So the answer is both. Well, I mean, it's not. I don't look for them. Usually, it's something that's ingrained in my mind, and it flows into it. And it's a story that is ingrained in my mind because it troubles me. There's something that disturbs me about the story, and that's why it captures my imagination. That's why I want to sort of work through it. So optics-wise, though, I'm not going to rely on my memory of the story. I'm going to go to the story, and then when I go to the story, I'm going to notice that, like, oh wait, I hear that there's another version of this story, and that I maybe didn't know, and so then I'll go look up the version I didn't know, and so I'm doing both. I mean, I'm working from what I already know, but I do a lot of research, and not just with Jewish sources. I do a lot of research for all my books because my books all deal with historical material, and it's very, I'm an academic, and it's very important for me to get things to be accurate with the historical material. So I'm doing a lot of research for all of my novels, not only in Jewish sources but in historical material as well.
Thank you.
Nadine.
I actually have two questions. So the first question is, you said that you use English as a new Jewish language. So my question would be, do you consider yourself primarily as a Jewish writer or as an American writer? And the second question, I would address this to you as an academic and also as a novelist. So Irving Howe, who wrote a very important anthology about American Jewish literature or Jewish literature in general, said a few years, well, actually a long time ago, that American Jewish literature had no future. And he, of course, linked it to the origin of American Jewish literature in the 20th century as immigrant literature. So I was just wondering, because I think many contemporary American Jewish authors very often turn to Europe and to other places than America in their writing. I mean, for example, Steve Stern or Jonathan Safran Foer or Nicole Krauss and so on. So do you think that there is still something distinctly American in American Jewish writing? Or where do you exactly see its place and its future?
Sure. So just to add to the point about this Irving Howe's essay, which is like, American Jewish writing is like playing itself out. And he was talking about sort of the middle of the 20th century generation or late 20th century Jewish writers like, Philip Roth or Bernard Malamud or Saul Bellow or these kinds of people. And I think that he's really been proven wrong. And I think the reason he's been proven wrong is because he really saw American Jewish writing as sort of documenting the immigrant experience, and specifically documenting the immigrant experience and sort of the child of immigrant experience of the idea of acculturating into America. That was what the narrative was. I think first of all, anytime anybody tells you that such and such Judaism has no future, like that's just sort of like a little mark next to it. It's like there's just like people are gonna be laughing at you in 30 years, right? I mean, that's just that seems to be the pattern. But I think that that what I always found actually frustrating about reading those writers like somebody like Philip Roth. Well, I'll tell you. Here's a good example of this. Philip Roth is actually a very good example of this. Philip Roth's first book, Goodbye Columbus, is the title. It's a collection of short stories published in 1950. Let's call it 57, or 1957, and that is the title story is about a poor Jewish boy from Newark, New Jersey, falls in love with a rich Jewish girl from Short Hills, New Jersey, and this girl who lives in Short Hills, it's like her family is like the first Jewish family to live in Short Hills, and they have to, she gets a nose job so that she'll look less Jewish when she goes to Radcliffe, the women's college at Harvard, and I read this novel when I was a teenager. And I just laughed and laughed and laughed for all the wrong reasons, because I grew up in Short Hills, New Jersey. I went to public schools in Short Hills, New Jersey, which were probably a third Jewish. I went to Harvard, like Brenda Potemkin, this girl who got the nose job to fit in better at Harvard. I learned Yiddish at Harvard. So, I mean, this was just like a different planet from Philip Roth. And, and I think sort of a much more interesting planet in that you like what was, to me, what I found also very frustrating about reading the work of those writers is that those writers were not really writing about, they were not really writing about the content of the Jewish tradition. They were writing about sort of the experience of Judaism being like a social identity, about being an outsider, or being an immigrant child, a child of immigrants, or something like that. But they were not, either they were not themselves educated in the Jewish tradition, they didn't really have sort of like the material to draw on, or in some cases, or that just like that wasn't what was of interest to them. It certainly wasn't marketable to an English-speaking audience at that time. I think, it's funny because, you had writers like Saul Bellow who were, at publishing and would always be like, no, I'm not a Jewish writer. I'm just a writer. I'm an American writer. I'm not a Jewish writer. At that time it was like, like a career killer to be a Jewish writer. Now it's like a marketing asset. I'm really serious. Like there's an event that's run by the Jewish Book Council, which like runs these Jewish book fairs throughout the United States, and they have now. It used to be like they had to like find people to go speak at these Jewish book fairs. Now there's like an audition where hundreds of people come to this. People who are not Jewish, they wrote a book that has nothing to do with anything. They wrote a book about losing weight. A book about anything, but they come because there's like the publishers know, the non-Jewish publishers. the publishers know these people buy books. And so it's become like a marketing angle. Like, how can you get yourself into the Jewish book fairs? Which is, to me, it's absurd for so many reasons. But so this is a different sort of, so just from a commercial point of view, it's a very different environment. But I think also, there's much more, like what I was interested in doing was creating much more of a content that was drawn from Jewish tradition. So to your question, I keep it, and I feel like people still answer this question in this way where, one thing that happens when you publish a novel about these Jewish themes in English for an American audience is that you start getting invited to participate in panels, that usually are like at a synagogue or at a JCC, and they always have like me and like two other people who wrote on Jewish themes, like the people you mentioned. And then there's always a moderator who's like, "Do you consider yourself a Jewish writer?" And then the other people on the panel are all like, "No, I don't consider myself a Jewish writer." And I'm thinking, like, why are we all sitting here in a synagogue? It's like weird to say, like, who do you think like paid for your airfare? It's like so stupid, But then it's also just, what I think is interesting is that there isn't a legitimate debate to be had about what makes somebody a Jewish writer. Is it whether the writer's Jewish? Is it whether the character? Is it something about the sensibility? The stupid things. And I think actually having done this for like 12 years, I actually have a definition of what makes someone a Jewish writer in America. What makes you a Jewish writer in America today is your likelihood of being asked to participate on a panel during which you will be asked this question: do you consider yourself a Jewish writer? Right? That's actually the threshold for what makes you a Jewish writer. So for that, I qualify. But for your other, your sort of more profound question is like, about other writers who are sort of looking backward. That I do find problematic. I find that there's an overemphasis on. I think that there's a sort of a weird nostalgia for Eastern European Jewish life. There's also an obsession with the Holocaust, but that's a whole. We can put that over here for now. But so I'm not going to go there yet. If that's of interest, we can talk about it. But there's an obsession with the Holocaust for sure. But there's also this kind of like, prior to that, this like really like deep nostalgia for Eastern European Jewish life. And I think this is a point at which I am perhaps somewhat different from a lot of the other writers who are writing in this genre because I studied Yiddish, because I have read a lot about this world. Like, I'm not nostalgic for that world. Like, you read these stories by these people, I'm like, you don't want to live in that world. I really, really don't want to live in that world. And so that's something where I think, and I think that it always makes me very sad when writers sort of resort to writing about this old world, because it suggests that there isn't enough of interest to write about here. And I find that very depressing. So that I think is a sort of a dismal kind of thing, and I find like I don't tend to enjoy those kinds of books.
So this isn't. Maybe this is a bad question.
I don't know if I really answered.
But I want to follow up on Carrie's question, Nadine's question a little bit. Just you're not. One could say you're not setting the bar high enough for being a Jewish writer. In other words, you.
Well, yeah, okay. You could be writing a book about weight loss, and
Right, and get asked, "Are you a Jewish writer?" on a panel.
Right.
Why not ask of Jewish writers that they be well versed in the texts of Judaism, as you have chosen to make yourself? I mean, is that incidental to what you're doing, or is it of the essence?
Oh, it's an essence of what I'm doing.
So why? I mean, why?
But you're saying, like, why should I not demand that of other writers?
I
mean, it's not my position to demand something of people. Like, I'm not inviting people to a Jewish book fair.
Yeah, but I'm saying
right?
you're allowing there to be like no normative judgment on this sort of thing, which is a very nice thing to do. It's like, well, you do your thing and I do my thing, but it doesn't seem to me like this is inconsequential. If one
it's
says,
not.
Yeah, okay, so maybe
it's not. I will say that of the writer that I most admire among American Jewish writers is Cynthia Ozick. I don't know if anyone's familiar with her work, but Cynthia Ozick is one of the people from the earlier generation. I mean, she's really like the age of like Philip Roth, but her work is and she's writing in English for a general American audience, a general English audience. But her work is very much drawn from and inspired by Jewish texts, and in a very high level and a very erudite way, and in a way that I think is also, as I aspire for my books to be also accessible to a reader who may not be familiar with this material. So she was very much sort of the model for me. I was sort of starved for work like that when I was a teenager, and when I started, I was interested in the intersection between literature and religion, even from when I was a teenager. And so as a teenager, I didn't really know how to express that, and so I would say, I'm interested in Jewish literature, but when you tell someone you're interested in Jewish literature, it's like they hand you a book by Philip Roth. That wasn't what I was looking for. And she was what I was looking for. But there are very few people writing in English who are doing that. There are more now than there were then, but there are very few. But I will say that in general, this is like a very small, this is a very small world that we're talking about to begin with.
Hananel.
You said before that writing has took a big part in your life from a very young age. And I wish to hear about your experience of writing, the act of writing.
Now or from when I was a child or both?
Let's do both.
Whatever, both.
Okay. Well, when I was a child, for me, it came from this kind of obsession with time, which is still true. From when I was a very young child, and I don't know why, I don't know if there's a particular reason why I felt this, but I felt sort of always this constant awareness of time disappearing and trying to sort of think of how I could capture it. And so when I was a child, what interested me about writing was not creating stories. I never was writing. My first novel was the first fiction I ever wrote when I was 22 or something, or 23. I never was writing stories when I was a child. What I was writing was diaries and journals, and even my diaries. It wasn't me writing about my thoughts and my I fell in love with this boy, and it wasn't about that. It would be notes about things about the people around me. It wasn't really about my personal psyche. That wasn't even of interest to me. It was more my family traveled a lot when I was a child, and so I would keep these journals of trips that we went on and things that we saw. It was almost like travel writing. When I was a child, I became very fascinated by Benjamin of Tudela, Binyamin Tudela, and I thought that was the most amazing thing that I had ever heard of. That this guy went around the world documenting Jewish communities around the world. And actually, I have a character in my first novel, who's based on is a modern Benjamin of Tudela. And actually, one of the most gratifying moments for me as a parent recently was when I found my 9-year-old daughter with a library book that was a children's picture book version of Benjamin of Tudela. Which I'm oh, I love you, Uri Shulevitz, random author who wrote this children's book version of Benjamin of Tudela. I'm this is amazing. She was Mommy, this book is amazing. I was I know. Anyway, so just sort of this idea of documenting something that was going to be lost and sort of, and saving it like that. And I do feel that's something that comes from Judaism. In that, as a Jew living in the diaspora, I always had this, there was always this feeling that this whole thing was on paper, and here, take this, and it's your parents say to you, here, take this, and then you say to your children, here, take this, and it's it's not about the land, right? I mean, when you're a diaspora Jew, it's not about the land, it's about here, we wrote this down and take this, and here it's yours, right? And so that was that idea that you could preserve something in words, and so that was something that all of my writing up until I was 22 was nonfiction documentary writing. That was what was interesting and important to me about it, and so the only time it transitioned into writing a novel was that I had these, the one thing I used to do is I couldn't even keep up with it in diaries, because I would write a diary about things that happened to me, but that was like inadequate because like I wasn't going to write about what happened to him, right? And so what happened to him, what I started doing was I kept a diary of things that happened to me, which truthfully was more about other people in my life. But then I had a notebook that I would keep, and I still have this. I have it in my bag right now. I carry it with me everywhere. I have a notebook where it's things that happen to other people. Things that I notice, something I read about, something somebody said to me, something I saw in a museum, something I heard on the news, anything that sort of I find interesting and I don't yet know what to do with it, but it troubles me or interests me, and I write it down. And the first time I wrote my first novel, the way I started writing it was that I was in this boring year in England, and I was taking a train from London to Cambridge, and it was like I was running through the train station, and I didn't have anything with me, and I was like a 45-minute train ride, and the only thing I had with me was this notebook. And I started just reading. This was like, in the days before smartphones, right? So like, otherwise I would have been sitting here like reading whatever stupid thing on the internet. But this was on the days before smartphones. I didn't even have a cell phone or anything like that. So I had this notebook, and I just started reading through the notebook. And I had never read through it before. Like, I never really went back. Like, once in a while, like, obviously I was using it for a purpose. Like, I would go back, like, I decided to write an article about this, and then I went back and keep my notes on this. But I would sort of just use it like as a reference. I never was like reading it through. So I was sitting on this, and I started reading it through. And I started noticing patterns in what I was recording. Things that wouldn't appear to be related to each other, but in my mind, I knew how they were related to each other. I could give you some really random examples, but I don't want to bore everybody here. You'll like bore me. Okay, so bore you? Yeah, okay, I'll bore you. So, for example, in that particular notebook, there was one of the first things that was down in this notebook was a note about observation I had made among people I knew who had decided to become Balei Teshuva, like Chozrim B'Teshuva, people who decided to become more religious than their parents, or than the way they were raised, and sort of. What I found, several things that I found both interesting, positive and negative about, the personalities of people who I noticed making this decision. So I recorded that. Then I had a note that was something that I had seen in a newspaper about a missing link found in an uptown shop. And what this was it's a store. It's actually on the west side. I don't know if it still exists. I haven't lived here in a long time. But it was a store called Maxilla and Mandible. It's a nature store. It's on the Upper West Side, and it sells like shells and fossils, things like that. And there was a scientist who went into this store to buy a gift for somebody, and he was looking at there were skulls on the shelf, and he was like, that one doesn't look like any hominid that I know. And he bought this skull, he had it analyzed, and it was like a type of prehistoric man that had not yet been cataloged. Like, it was like the missing link between, Homo erectus and Homo whatever. So it was like, and he found it like in a gift shop. It was like this weird thing. And so I was like, that's wacky. So I just wrote that down. I was like, this is a really weird thing that I read in the newspaper. Then I had another example would be that story I told you about that from my friend's great-grandfather about the tefillin being thrown overboard. So those are just 3 examples. Oh, and then, one more example would be a friend who told me that when her mother was a teenager, she had a boyfriend who had given her a kitten as a gift. And the boyfriend gave her a kitten as a gift, and then they broke up, and he went away to college, and she never saw him again. But this kitten was growing into a cat. It grew into a cat, and then it kept growing. And it continued growing and growing and growing. And she eventually realized that it was an ocelot. It's an ocelot. It's like a mountain lion. She had to give it away to the zoo. But at that point, this was like the days before the internet. She couldn't track down this guy and be like, "Hey, how the heck did you give me an ocelot?" It's like this weird. So these things. So here there's 4 stories, right? There's no connection between any of these stories for any person other than me. For me, there are obvious connections between these 4 stories. All 4 of these stories, to simplify it, and I will say that because this relates to me being a literary scholars, this is all you do is look for these connections that are in books. And in books, they're put there intentionally. In life, it's like random, where you're imposing your own meaning on the things that are random in life. But the meaning I imposed on these 4 random events was I saw this sort of as a question about that story of reclamation, of reclaiming a past, or sort of reclaiming a past or something sort of changing in a gradual way so that what you started with was not what you ended up with. And so that was sort of like the story of like the Balei Teshuva or the Chozrim B'Teshuva, people who became more religious, people, like a kitten that turned into a mountain lion, that sort of, but also that's question, but each of those situations is also sort of a question of reclamation, because it's like you have a domesticated animal that turns out to be a wild animal that needs to be set back in a wild setting, or then you have like, the missing link is the same, like the skull that really is, is of greater value than it was in this junk shop, but really it was of this greater value, sort of like the tefillin that are thrown overboard. And similar to the way the person who becomes a Baal Teshuva, the person who becomes more religious, feels that their parents have thrown away some kind of inheritance that they should have received from their parents but didn't. So, it's those kinds of connections that lead me to my books. And so I don't plan, so about your question about the process, I don't plan my books at all, any of them. I never, and that's not just the first book, all of my books, I don't plan them. And even while I'm writing them, there's no outline, there's no plan, I'm writing it like the same way that a reader would read it, like I want to know what happens next. Like that's actually, I'm writing it to find out what happens next. I don't know before the last page what the last page is going to be. Which doesn't mean I don't go back and revise it and have it make more sense. But, as I'm writing it, I don't know what's going to happen. And the way that my books start is that they accrue. Like they come together from these disparate elements that I collect. And when I collect enough material, I see, aha, this is the thing that's of interest to me now. And then what I do is I create, and sometimes it begins with like a situation. And then with the situation, then the characters emerge. And then what happens usually is then the characters like have their own life. And then that's where it's like this question of free will versus destiny, right? I mean, it's like I should be like the godlike figure who's like moving these people around, but I'm not, because much like in this divine and human covenantal relationship, I don't really have full control over these people because they're going to do what they want to do, which sounds like a very sort of, the characters get away with you. And like if you're a person who's never been engaged in creative work, you probably hear that and you're like, she's crazy. But let me explain it in a way that let me give you the non-crazy version of what that actually means. What that means is that when you start a story, anything can happen. At the beginning of a story, there are endless possibilities. But once you get to 15 pages before the end of the story, there are no longer endless possibilities. Right? I mean, it's not true that, at the end of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo's not going to go run off with Juliet's nurse. That could have happened at the beginning of the book, right? But it can't happen at the end of the book, because, and when I say that, that's when the writer says, oh, the characters got away from me, it's not that they magically disappeared or wandered off. It's that as you're writing the story, the elements of the characters become more, they emerge and they become more solidified in such a way that other possibilities are not possible, right? I mean, it's the same even a person growing up, when you're a child, it's what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, I could be anything. It's but by the time you're 25, it's if you're 25, you're not going to, or you're 36, you're not going to suddenly turn around and go become a nuclear physicist if you didn't start that way when you were 20, right? I mean, it's just not going to happen. So, or if it is, that's the story, right? So, then they can't be writing about anything else. So those, that's what I mean when I say that the story, the characters get away from you. And for me, it's actually, it's similar to when you are a parent of a child, right? And that, there's things you can control at the beginning of the child's life, and then the older the child gets, the less control perhaps you have. And I think that to me it also is, it's I find it religiously significant because to me it's sort of for me personally, it is like a very small window on a divine and human relationship, because you sort of wonder about this. Something that's troubled me since childhood is this verse in the Mishnah, which is Hakol Tzafui V'Reshut Netuna, right? That everything is foreseen. In other words, that God foresees everything, but that freedom of choice is given. So it's this is a paradox, right? Because if everything is foreseen, then how could it be that we have a free will? And so, but I see that possibility. I see how those two possibilities actually work in tandem in my own writing, because I see that, Havdil, as I'm creating my very small and insignificant world in the pages of this book, I see that there's limitations. My characters have free will in some sense, and there's a point at which I do not have control over them anymore.
By the way, you snuck in Lahavdil there, and one of the things that you also do in your novels occasionally is that you will Englishize these think that like these Jewish verbal expressions. I just picked this up because it was close to the page that I read earlier. Years later, Der Nister would notice how much Peretz, not to compare them, resembled Stalin. Oh, that what you're really saying is lahavdil.
Of course, of course.
Nama.
So exactly.
Peretz and Stalin do look alike. Just
I
physically, they
know.
look alike. Yes, lahavdil. Yes.
It's exactly what I wanted to ask you. I also have to.
Microphone's coming.
Sorry. So my first question was, we discussed today about the importance of the Hebrew and how you said you agree that we should dedicate ourselves more to teach Hebrew in the diaspora. And now Alan was quoting that you are trying, and you affirmed it, that you're trying to create a Jewish language, like an English Jewish language. So I wanted to know if you think, if you want to do it as to adapt yourself to the current situation, or is your stories used not only to create a gate to the Talmud, but also to create a gate to Hebrew? And the other question is, if you think that the idea of Chadash Yameinu Kekedem, of like returning and nostalgia and to always feel like it's supposed to be like the older days, do you think it's a Jewish idea or a universal idea?
Thank you. So I'm going to answer the last part of the question first, which is, do I think it's a Jewish idea or a universal idea? I will say it is definitely not a universal idea if you live in America. Because nobody here gives a crap about the past. That is like, the past is like, oh wow, the Reagan administration, right? Like, seriously, if you go to California, there are signs on stores in California. Not even California, they even here. It's like, this such and such store since 1989. They're like advertising, like, since 1989, right? I'm like, wow, I'm so impressed. You've been in business since 1989. Congratulations, Mazel Tov. So, I mean, this is like not a country where, and I will say that actually I see this as being something that's part of, it's part of the American dream. Is the whole founding legend of America is about renouncing the past. If you this is something that I think about a lot, because the founding legend of America is that it doesn't matter who your parents are. It doesn't matter where you came from, who your grandparents are, what your pedigree is, what your past is. What matters is, what is the future. What matters is what you do with the opportunities this country gives you and how you use those opportunities to find your place in this country. I mean, that's what's called the American dream, right? And so if you think about it, I mean, in Judaism, you have the founding legend in Judaism, one of many, is that that it wasn't just when God gave the Torah to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, that it wasn't just that generation of Israelites that were receiving the Torah, but that all of their future descendants were also standing at Sinai to receive the Torah. I mean, if you think about that, that's like the opposite of the American dream, right? Because that's saying, actually, it does matter who your parents are, matters who your great-great-great-great-grandparents are, and the most important thing in your life happened, several thousand years before you were born, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, I mean, this is like very much, I'm obviously simplifying these things. But I don't think, in America, there's a national aversion to the past. And so I don't think that idea of going back in time, I do think it's part of many, many, many cultures in the world. It's not part of this one. And so that's something that is actually part of the uncomfortableness of American Jewish identity, is that you are part of this very, very old culture in a country where, not that this is such a young culture, but that this is a culture that's really based on erasing the past. You build a Walmart on an Indian burial ground, and you're like, yeah, now there's a Walmart. You can buy diapers there. It wasn't that useful before when it was an Indian burial ground. Like, who needed that? So this is like, that's really true. It really, really is true. So, this is something that I think is, so that's something that I think about a lot. And but to go back to your other question about, about Hebrew. And you and I were talking about this before, and I know that we've talked about this before. I actually do agree with this idea that, there should be a birthright Hebrew. I would love for there to be, I would love for Israel and people, institutionally, to take a greater role in teaching diaspora Jews Hebrew. I was talking about this with you and some other people earlier, how when my young children go to public school, though they have various other ways that they're learning Hebrew, but I was looking online to download apps for them to learn Hebrew. And there's just nothing there. I mean, there's just the stuff that's out there is just really lousy. And I mean, there's some what?
I have a couple of recommendations.
All right,
Generally,
maybe I've had them already, but yeah, but there's lousy, and like there's some that the ones that are good are like really basic, and like my daughter's like, so I finished. I'm like, okay. And now you like know all the colors and the numbers, and that's it. And now it's over.
Never mind, I have no recommendation.
Gus on the go. Gus on the go. They love Gus on the go, but Gus on the go teaches like 100 words, and it's not like in a sentence. But there's no sentences. You can't speak from Gus on the go. You can't even say hello from Gus on the go. It's only like colors and vegetables. Anyway, point being, we have a great app if you want to learn names of vegetables in Hebrew. If you're 4 years old, I have the app for you. Your 4-year-old wants to learn vegetables. Gus on the go. If they don't want to learn something beyond vegetables, it's a problem. And I'm just thinking, like, Israel, like, you have this high-tech, blah, blah, blah. Like, come on, like, entrepreneurial startup nation. Give us an app. I'm not asking that much. I'm asking for, like, an app. I'm not asking for, like, a giant, like, program from Sochnut and send people. Like, give us an app. How hard is this? So, anyway, yes, I am very in favor of people learning Hebrew. I would love for there to be more people who have access to these sources. So when I say that I'm writing in English as though English is a Jewish language, this is not instead of learning Hebrew. This is just addressing the reality that people here are using English. I mean, one of the things I find remarkable about this whole Tikva fellowship in New York is that, and I mentioned, we were talking with somebody about this over dinner, I don't remember who, but how, we talk about, there's such a sort of, conservative, and this is traditional, and how do we draw people back to traditional Jewish life, and Hebrew's so important. Like, did anyone notice this entire program is run in English? Yeah. So, I mean, that's, there's like, we don't even think about that part, right? I mean, maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe some of you do. But I've thought about it. So anyway, I think that this is the reality, that this is an English-speaking culture. And, I think that it's not that I don't want more people to learn Hebrew. It's that this is what we have right now. And I'm writing for people who are alive right now. I'm not writing for people who are alive in 25 years or 50 years or 100 years. I mean, it'd be nice if people are buying my books in 50 years, but I'm not counting on it. So I'm writing for people now, and this is, people are reading. This is what people are in this community are reading now. My books have been translated, which is nice. But that's, yeah.
But do you think, like, as a long-run vision, would you do you think it's, as a normative statement, do you think it would be a good thing for the Jews? I mean, maybe you should just drop. I mean, and many people think this way. Like, when I went to a summer camp in Ukraine, we were speaking with the kids English because it's a more universal language. So maybe we should really drop the Hebrew as our language and leave it for the Israelis. And, like, let's make our universal Jewish language English.
I have an answer to that, which is not quite a yes or a no, but I wrote an academic essay about this about 8 years ago, about English becoming a Jewish language. I started this essay by talking about, this was about 10 years ago, I saw a movie which probably many people in this room have seen called Trembling Before God. This is a documentary. It was like 10, 12 years ago. It was about gays and lesbians in Haredi communities. So that was what the movie was about. It was an interesting movie, worth seeing. I went to see it though because I found the subject matter interesting, and I heard it was a good movie. But while I was watching it, what interested me was the subtitles, because it's a documentary, and there are interviews in the movie. Some are in English, some are in Yiddish, some are in Hebrew, and after a while, I started, and I was trying not to look at the subtitles because I speak Hebrew, I speak Yiddish, I want to be able to hear these people's voices. But I noticed that the subtitles were like really distracting, and then I noticed that the reason they were so distracting is because they were also subtitling the English. And first I thought, oh, maybe this is for like hearing impaired, but then I realized that it wasn't because of that. It was because the people in this film who were speaking English, their English was so saturated with terms from Jewish life, with words from Jewish life, that a regular American moviegoer would not be expected to understand it. And I was like, wow, that's really strange. And I went to see this movie with an Israeli friend. We came out of the theater. She was laughing at this movie. She goes, I love the way American Jews speak Hebrew. And I was like, what are you talking about? There were no American Jews speaking Hebrew in this movie. And then she's laughing. She's like, who ever heard of the word halachically? I'm thinking, like, I've heard of the word halachically. It would never occur to me to call it Hebrew. And I'm thinking, like, well, what is this word halachically? I'm like, this is a word I would use if I was writing for the Jewish Review of Books. It's not a word I would use if I was writing for the New York Times. And I was thinking about this, and then, she was, and then I thought, this is actually a word that's formed in the way that a lot of Yiddish words are formed. There are many Yiddish words that have, like, a very difficult to translate root from a Semitic language, whether Hebrew or Aramaic, and then they conjugate it using Middle German grammar or Slavic grammar. This is how there's a lot of, and there are a lot of words like this. And I started thinking about it more and more. There are many, many words like this that have probably been used in many sessions in this building, on every floor of this building, time and time again. Actually, and I have a friend, a linguist named Sarah Benor, who actually, there's a website called jewish-languages.org, and she has a running dictionary of American Jewish terms. And they're not just, and that was something that, this is, and, a few hundred words is not a language, but in 500 years, it could be a language's beginnings. And so, I don't know that we would wish upon ourselves the kind of circumstances that would encourage the development of such a language. But I just thought she has a very, this linguist friend of mine has a very global perspective on how languages evolve and change. And it's often, modern Hebrew is very exceptional in that it's something that's a very intentionally developed language. But most languages evolve in ways that people are not controlling at the time when it's happening.
Professor Howland.
Thank you.
Hi.
Is it on? Okay. I wonder, you've talked about the cycle of rejection and recovery. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the tension between those two things in your own self-understanding as an author. So, on the one hand, you've talked about recovering the past. You even mentioned trying to create a new culture through, sort of transmitting these texts, these great texts into a new idiom and so forth. On the other hand, you've hinted, or maybe even more than hinted, that with regard to this earlier generation of American Jewish authors like Bill Roth, Saul Bellow, Isaac Bashevis Singer, that was then, this is now, and you stand at some distance from them. So I just wondered if you could talk about that tension, the sort of selective memory, if you like, or maybe one could say even to create you have to destroy or reject or make some negative gesture.
Well, thank you. This is an idea in literary theory, which Harold Bloom wrote a book called The Anxiety of Influence about, right, and he actually, I will say, he's speaking of the anxiety of influence, he stole that idea from an earlier book by Walter Jackson Bate called The Burden of the Past. It's like it's the same book, and it's like so annoying when you read it. You're like, wow, you did what you said these people do. You define yourself against what came before you, and that's like part of the creative process is sort of openly rejecting what came before you in order to announce yourself as original. I mean, for sure, that is part of what I do. It's part of what every creative artist does. I will say also, though, that there is sort of, I also feel a kind of a tension between like a modern Western idea of creativity and what I see as a Jewish idea of creativity, which is that there's this sort of big sign, generalizations ahead, which doesn't seem to be a problem at Tikva. In academic life, like you have to support everything, but here it's like generalizations are awesome. That's what we do. We're like a think tank. And so I say this in a joking way. No, I mean it. I actually mean it. Like I appreciate you need that to be bold. Like if you're going to be like a bold thinker, like you have to generalize. And so I think that there's a timidity in academic thinking that doesn't often include that. I really do mean that as a compliment, even though I'm joking about it. I really do. I'm not just.
I have a thick skin.
Yes, right. I'm not just recovering. I say that the generalization ahead that I'm putting my sign up for is that I think that in a lot of Western cultures since the Romantic period, you have a premium placed on creative artists on originality. That that your value as an artist is all about how original you are, right? How much your work deviates from that which came before you. And I think you probably could date that to the Romantic movement. But again, if you want to go into the generalization business, you could probably sit here for a longer analyzing this. But I will say that I think that's quite different from there's I think a really different idea of creativity in traditional Judaism. Big generalization ahead, where I think that you don't have this idea of the individual and originality being priorities. In fact, if anything, you have the opposite. You have the idea of communal identity and unoriginality, in the sense like what makes you a great thinker in traditional Jewish life is not how original you are, but how unoriginal you are, like how well you work with what came before you. That's where your strength is, as opposed to, this idea that you have this Western idea of like that the greatest artist is like, the genius living in a garret, dying of consumption, and that it's the genius living in a garret who's totally isolated from all other influences. And you see this even now, like in modern, like in creative writing workshops. They have like they don't teach literature in creative writing workshops. It's like this idea that like you're supposed to just create like out of nothing, like about from the muse or something. And like these creative writing workshops, they're always like out in the country. They're like, in McDowell Colony, or like, they're in the woods, or they're in Iowa, or like, they sort of are deliberately located in some place where you're unlikely to interact with other people who might influence you with their ideas, right? And I think that this is like really like this American tradition of, it's both. It's a Western and an American tradition of like what matters is being original and the individual and going out and your little homestead or something. And in Judaism, you have like exactly the opposite value in terms of creativity. So that's so while yes, you're absolutely right that I am very much defining myself against what this earlier generation of writers were doing. I'm also sort of defining myself against the idea of creativity where what makes you creative is how original you are versus how unoriginal you are. It's like these passages that I find it interesting that the two passages that Alan chose to read from my book are both passages where I'm lifting stuff like almost verbatim from earlier sources. I mean, like the parrots thing with Der Nister and parrots is almost all from this essay that he wrote about it, and then that, of course, the passage from the Talmud. So, to me, that's. But you could speak against what I'm saying and saying like, well, that's your way of being original. By being unoriginal.
Well, I mean, and,
maybe. Yeah.
And because I made those choices, I should say, I mean, they are woven into a story, so that the Der Nister plot has a lot to do with the plot that's happening in the 20th century and that sort of thing.
Yes.
So it's not simply an anthology of other people.
Yeah, no. That's true.
Okay, Leah, you've been waiting on.
Microphone?
Sure.
So I'm interested in the idea that literature, I think, has the unique power to help people to be able to think for themselves about different concepts. I was wondering if you had trouble achieving that as someone who defines themselves as a Jewish American author. Do you have trouble kind of seeing these kind of like big ideas, like ideas about life, death, these kind of things that seem to have pretty strong definitions in the Jewish tradition? Do you have trouble finding the ambiguity that in it, or not?
Do I have trouble finding ambiguity in these sort of larger human themes?
Yeah, yeah, especially if you're taking from sources that maybe define it pretty well.
It's an interesting question. I actually think that there is a lot of ambiguity in Jewish tradition. And I think that that's something that comes out in what I do in my books. I think that one example of this would be like this is not giving away a plot point, but the last chapter of this book, Of the World to Come. Yikes, that was bad. Well, okay. It was unnecessary. I don't even know what I was trying to do over there. There's the points in which let's put it this way, without sort of pointing to particular plots. The points at which my books engage with Jewish tradition are the points where those things, I think, are ambiguous. So it's not that Judaism doesn't have very clearly defined ideas about a lot of things. It does. It's not like, you can read whatever you want into it. I don't believe that. Some people do. I don't. But the points that are of interest to me and which I'm exploring as an artist are the points where I think there is a lot of ambiguity. So one example is the idea of an afterlife. Like, I don't think this is, I think, you could probably point to other religious traditions where there's a very clear, maybe not unambiguous, but very vivid descriptions of an afterlife and very clear and not a lot of ambiguity. And I don't think that you can really say that about Judaism. Well, we have many traditions involving an afterlife. Like, it isn't I don't think that there's sort of this idea of like, what does Judaism say happens when we die? It's not like there's like an answer that's X. I don't know that there really is for other traditions either, but for sure that is not clear in Judaism. So in this novel, In the World to Come, there is a fantastical chapter toward the end of the book that is about that takes place in a supernatural world to come. But it is something that I have invented. And I have invented it. So there are elements of it that are drawn from Jewish sources, but there are elements of it that I made up. So, for example, the world to come in my story is inspired by that legend from the Talmud about the baby before it's born, who's taught all of these things about the secrets of the Torah and everything like that. But in my story, there's this world to come, which is populated by the already were's, who are people who have already passed away, and the not yet's, who are the people who aren't yet born. And that's the population. And the already were's are educating and training the not yet's. But this is done in there's a variety of ways in which this is done, and it's sort of one example is that they drink books. So, and this is actually taken from, and they eat art and they drink books. But and these are things that are inspired by religious sources, like in Yechezkel and Ezekiel, where it's he eats a scroll and then he knows what it says. But there's a scene where that takes place in a bar in the world to come, and their bar, and there's a whole wine list at this bar, and it's like, well, what would you like to drink? And it's like, well, there's Genesis. Would you like a bottle of Genesis? Sure, have a bottle of Genesis. And they bring, my cup runneth over, right? And it's sort of like there's a series of things like that, and there's I could read you this passage if this is of interest. I don't know if it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I could. Yeah, so that's you would be entertained by this probably, because this is the kind. So I think I have a more marked up version of it in here, because I have an edited version of this. But this isn't the one we read, so it's irrelevant. Anyway, so yeah, this is the drinking age in the world to come is 21. 21 days, that is. 3 weeks until your time has come to be born. At that point, the not-yets are allowed into the famous bars of the world to come, where they have to choose for themselves whether to remain sober, to let themselves get a bit tipsy, or to drink themselves to birth. But the drinks in these bars aren't like the poor, dingy ones in the world below. Instead, the vast wine cellars in the world to come are filled with bottled books. They are arranged, these wine cellars, like libraries by vineyard, varietal, vintage, author, genre, date. The librarian sommeliers bring up the requested bottles carefully. I'm just going to try to skip down a little bit. Wary drinkers usually ask to see the label before opening the bottle to make sure it matches the title and author's name is matching what they ordered. Deuteronomy, Daniel cried when a drowsy bartender offered a flinty screw-capped carafe. I asked for Deuteronomy, not for the new economy. The true bibliophiles are also offered a drop to sample first, swiveling under their tongues to test for basic quality. Pfft, Daniel once spat. Plagiarism. After that, it's simply a matter of taste and how long it takes for one to get drunk. So I'm going to skip ahead to this, and so where he decides where this he meets this sommelier, who of course is one of his own ancestors, who brings her up this bar that it says she brings it right up. Says a few minutes later she returned from the cellar, landing in his nook with a bottle in one hand. Here it is, she said, and brandished the bottle's glowing label in his face. It said Genesis. Clueless, Daniel nodded as she poured a few drops into his glass. You have to drink it slowly to appreciate it, she said. A lot of people just chug it down and miss the whole point. He raised the glass to his lips and sipped the liquid carefully, holding it under his tongue, unsure of what to expect. At first, it was sickly sweet. Darkness, water, light, earth, sun, moon, stars, typical. But then it heated up and then burned with spices, then turned creamy, grassy, suddenly flattened into a bitter tannin. Just before he swallowed, it reared itself up into a final burst of flavor, fruit from the tree of knowledge, which fruitfully multiplied before flowing down his throat. This is very good, he muttered a moment later, and poured himself a full glass. This whole vintage is exceptional, Rosalie told him, as he slurped it down, swallowing a vast flood of pure rainwater and the chalky remnants of a collapsing tower before bracing his stomach against the flinty tannin of a man holding a knife to his son's throat. You'd be surprised, though, the sommelier said. There are people who take one sip and spit the whole thing out. So it's a lot of things like that. I'm taking these traditional sources, but I'm doing something that I don't think anybody's ever done before. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
I like the bit about when his breath reeks of Ecclesiastes.
Oh, yeah. Yes. When he meets somebody else, he's like, "Ugh, you've been drinking Ecclesiastes again."
Meditations.
Yes.
I have two questions. The first one is you talk a lot about the Hebrew and English, so I wanted to ask if there's any influence by Israeli authors and Israeli literature. And the second question I want to ask is about the canon of the Jewish books, because it seems to me from a lot of people talking here that the Jewish mysticism is almost missing. So I wanted to ask is there any influence by also Jewish mysticism, like the Zohar book, or only the sages?
Okay, so in terms of Israeli authors, I will say that I started writing these books, and this is not really Israeli stam. Now it's like Eretz Israeli, but Agnon is someone I read. When I started writing these novels, I was just gorging on Agnon. I was drinking the bottles of Agnon. So that was yes.
What language did you read them?
In Hebrew.
Okay.
Yeah, in Hebrew. In Agnon, you have to read in Hebrew, right? So in Agnon, that was really of interest to me. In terms of more contemporary writers that were of interest to me, what I'm trying to there was ones that I like. It's I like one book, but I don't like the other books. But just thinking who else did I really like and really didn't like? Contemporary writers. I mean, I liked. There was I liked Marmani. I liked of Bet Yoshua's Marmani. I don't really like some of the other books, but that's a book that I really love. That does that question of going backwards and backwards in time. I read that when I was a teenager, and I just found that really exciting that you could go backwards instead of forwards. Even just conceptually, that idea was really exciting to me. I like a lot of Meir Shalev. I think that he sort of he really is someone who is playing with these biblical themes from the Tanakh and but in a sort of in a more in a lighter way, obviously much lighter than someone like Agnon, but in a more and in an artistic way that I find interesting. So he's someone that I admire. I could bore you with a list of people, but I think that in terms of your second question about mysticism, that's actually many people who write about my books say that they're all about mysticism. I mean, I don't know if people really know what they mean when they say mysticism. A lot of
religion,
probably. But, this is it means something very particular in Jewish tradition. I will say that I would say I am very influenced because the beginning of what I see is the beginning of modern Yiddish literature. And so sounds like it's a totally different question, but it's not. The beginning of modern Yiddish literature to me is Nachman of Bratslav. And the stories of Nachman of Bratslav, Sipore Maises of Nachman of Bratslav. These are folk tales, but he's telling them with a religious purpose. And this is it's they're Kabbalistic stories. Which are very, very complicated and very, there are many, many layers of meaning to them. And what's interesting is that Nachman of Bratslav was writing this from a totally religious perspective, and it very much embodies that idea of Chassidut, of Hasidism being sort of a practical inheritor of Kabbalah, right? And that's not true of all of Chassidut, that's not true of all of Hasidism, but it is, I think, very much expressed in his stories. You see the direct line between Kabbalah, between Jewish mysticism and Hasidism in his stories. And what's interesting to me about that is that Nachman of Bratslav becomes very important predecessor for secular modern Yiddish writers. who are many of whom are very, like, he was almost became more widely read among secular writers than he was in the religious world. I mean, not really, because of course Bratslávers, this is their holy text, but his stories are very, very widely read and admired and copied in a lot of ways by secular writers. And there are Yiddish plays about the Bratslaver. There are Yiddish poems about the Bratslaver written by secular people. And so that kind of influence, and I think that whole idea of, his idea of storytelling comes from Kabbalah. His idea of storytelling is that there's this sort of destruction of the world. It's this idea of the tzimtzum, right, of the contraction of God, which shatters these vessels, and that then there's this process of restitution where you have to put these pieces together. His process of storytelling is about sort of reconstituting these vessels. I think that many modern Jewish writers in various languages, and I feel this, are indebted to that idea, whether or not they know or aware of it consciously. I think that is an idea that's very influential in modern storytelling, is this idea of a broken story that needs to be repaired. The idea of, like, you're not going to just write a fable where there's a moral of the story and here's your moral, but you're going to use that fable form and sort of find something different in it, or try to rebuild that. It's like a broken fable that you're trying to rebuild. And so in that larger sense, I would say that I am very inspired by Kabbalah. But that's like a very vague and broad kind of way. And I'm sure that somewhere in my books I talk about Kabbalah more directly than that. But my most recent book is about Rambam, and so that was all the way on the other end of the spectrum in terms of not particularly mystical.
Adi.
You defined yourself earlier as a Jewish author, and you mentioned few Israeli authors such as Aleph Bet Yoshua and others. And I'm just wondering, comparing contemporary Israeli authors such as Etgar Keret and others that are usually described as a thin literature. I mean, a literature that doesn't refers backwards.
I was going to say, when you say, I know you're using a term of art, which is like Lashon Razeh, right?
Yeah, Safar as a
yes, it's like, what you mean by that is not that it's not thin, that it's not superficial literature, but that the language is not consciously referring to these sources.
Yeah, and what I was wondering regarding Etgar Keret, even regarding Said Kshua, which is actually not a Jewish.
Who I love, actually. I mean, I loved his, I don't love everything he writes, but I loved Guf Sheni Yachid.
Okay.
I thought that was a great book.
Would you describe them, would you define them as Jewish authors? I mean, what is Jewish about Etgar Keret? Let's put it this way. What is Jewish about this thin literature that doesn't refers backwards?
I think that it refers backward more than it knows. I think that there are, actually, I'm teaching some of the Etgar Keret stories in my class at the end of the week, so we'll talk about it more directly. But
about it, but
what?
I'm curious about
it. I think that they, I think with Etgar Keret in particular, he's writing in the fable form. He's writing fables. And these are fables. This is like, he's not writing it as like a mashal, like where it's a mashal and then a nimshal, but there is like, I think that there are, while his language, it's not like he's not like writing like Agnon where he's like referring to this rabbinic language, but I think that there is a structure to his stories, which I'm not going to sit here and claim that like, he's like this, great master artist, but I think that there is a structure in his stories that is drawn from that tradition of there needing to be like a moral of the story at the end. And I think that is something which is not unique to Jewish literature, but I think that I don't think that most modern writers in other cultures feel that pressure to provide that, or the pressure to, if they're not providing it, have it be the point of the story that they didn't provide it. I think that in a lot of other literature, there's sort of an idea that you can just kind of like write a novel that's just about like a crumbling marriage or a failed love affair or something like that, and that's enough. But I think that what I found is like a lot of these writers, even when they're doing that, they sort of can't avoid it. Like I recently read a novel by Tzruya Shalev, which was what was it called? Chayei Ava. It's just like, it's like a romance novel. It's about a woman who's having an affair with a married man or whatever, like, or she's married and she's having an affair. It's like in a lot of ways, I think it was heralded, I think, as being like, look, Israeli literature has entered into like the greater, wider world, and look, she's writing about universal themes. Yes. Okay. Yes. It's a book about sex and it's a book about love and desire. Okay. But the main character She's writing her dissertation about the destruction of the temple. Okay? And like that's like continuously, repeatedly referred to about how she can't complete this dissertation because she's busy having this affair with this guy, and you know how she wants to write about it. And it's not just about the destruction of the temple, it's about legends of the destruction of the temple. Like, you know, the story about like, you know, the two children who were taken into slavery and then they're put in a room together and they're supposed to have sex together to make more slaves, but they recognize each other as brother and sister. And it's like, there's no French writers who are doing this, right? I mean, they might be within the French tradition, I don't know. But, like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, this is not, like, and this is, like, you know, the ultimate. And, I mean, that is a novel that's, like, it's all about sex, right? I mean, this is not, like, you know, and the language is not, like, she's not referring to these, but she is. It's almost like, and, like, you know, in a book like that, like, you know, and Eckhart Carrett's writing these stories that are, like, 4 paragraphs long, right? So, I mean, you know, there's more you can avoid when you're writing 4 paragraphs. But I feel like even with the 4 paragraphs, you know, he talks about how influenced he is by Kafka. Kafka is very influenced by Nachman of Bratslav. Very, like, Kafka's like directly, Kafka has stories that are just copied from Nachman of Bratslav. And he writes about, he writes about all of his diaries. Kafka was very steeped in Yiddish literary tradition. So, you know, I don't think that that's an accident. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think that those things are unrelated to each other. I actually think that, you know, in a lot of ways, Etgar Keret, while his language may be sort of more, you know, thinner or less, you know, dependent on these earlier sources, I think his plots are more Jewish, so to speak, than like early Amos Oz. Even though early Amos Oz, when I say early, I mean like, you know, Amos Oz's early stories from the 1960s. I think like if you look at those stories, like while the language itself is more rooted in biblical language, the plot structure of the story, I think you don't see traditional plot structures. So I think that I think that it's hard to avoid. I'm going to put it that way. I think it's very hard to avoid. And I think it's hard to avoid because you're writing in this language. I think that, like, honestly, like, even with my novels, like, I'm writing in English, and while I'm trying to write in this Jewish religious idiom, I mean, I'm still, like, there are elements in my novels that are very, very American, and that are really, you know, that I wouldn't have written in the way I wrote them, except that I'm an American writer. And so, I mean, I think that there's a sort of a fate to language that can't really be avoided. And in a sense, the harder you try to avoid it, the more you end up stuck in it.
One more question. Eliane.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I was just wondering, first of all, what you are doing for a living, meaning at university, what is your field of research?
Yes.
And also, what is your... I know a few writers, and I know everyone has their crazy things to make them start writing. So, like, I know people that eat sardines, drink whiskey. Everyone has their own thing. So, just wanted to hear what is your thing that makes you start writing, except having a dissertation on the side that you need to finish.
Okay, so in terms of what I'm researching, you know, honestly, like I'm not an academic. I'm not a traditional academic. Like I'm not a professor at such and such university where I'm producing academic work every year. Like I'm teaching next semester at Harvard. I've taught in this institution. I've taught at other colleges and universities. But I'm not like, because I'm not like in a tenure track post, it's not like, oh, I have to always be working on my tenure book or something like that. So I'm not like sitting here researching these fields. So what I'm doing rather is like I write, my nonfiction work is usually like shorter projects where I take on a topic and I just dive into it. And I do that in essays. An example is that essay I wrote for Azure about that's a good example actually. That's an essay I wrote about. It was about myths of diaspora communities' origins. So in mythologies that they tell themselves about their origins. So I gave the example of the story of like my family, the American Jewish legend of my family's name was changed at Ellis Island, which I demonstrated historically. It's not true. No one's name was ever changed at Ellis Island. I can bore you with why, but anyway, that's a legend that was created by the American Jewish community, and I compared it to different legends about the founding of earlier Jewish communities. So, for example, in Avraham ibn Daud, there is a medieval Spanish Jewish scholar who has this book called Sefer Kabbalah, which is a book of tradition, and it's supposed to be demonstrating how there's this like direct line from the academies of Babylonia to Spain. And he has this story which like, it's just like total nonsense story about like, you know, there were these 4 rabbis who were on a ship in the Mediterranean and it was captured by pirates, and you know the 4 rabbis were sold in slavery to 4 different communities, and this was how these 4 communities were. I was like, there's just no way this actually happened, and it's actually been studied that it's impossible that this happened. And so, but this is there's this need to create a kind of there's a need to create a sense of continuity, or to explain a disruption. And the other story I explained in that vein was the legend of the Jews' arrival. There's many legends associated with the Jews' arrival in Poland. And the one I was looking at was the more fantastical one, which is when the Jews first arrived in the Polish forest, they found all of the Masechot, all the tractates of the Talmud carved into the trees, waiting for them. Okay, so a little more obviously fantastical than my name was changed at Ellis Island. But I was looking at these different communities and what it is about these diaspora communities that they need to create these founding legends. So that's an example. I had a nonfiction book that I wrote a couple years ago, the book called The Rescuer. This was a book that was commissioned by Tablet, which is a American Jewish magazine. It's about one of the only American Jewish righteous Gentiles. Person who was a non-Jewish man who went to Europe to rescue people from the Holocaust, but he saved this the people he saved was this A-list of intellectuals. So it was Hannah Arendt, Marc Chagall, and people who weren't Jewish, Marcel Duchamp, Andre Breton. I mean, and it's why it's this guy also, and he was young, sexy, Harvard grad. It's he's better looking than Oscar Schindler. Why haven't we seen this movie already? And so the question, so I looked into this sort of why did this guy, he was totally forgotten even during his lifetime. And also when after the war, these people, famous people he saved would not give him the time of day. No one would associate with him. And so I was looking into why. And so the book I wrote about that is about why this was the case. So, so I wouldn't say I'm not a person who's sitting in an archive, documenting a complete bibliography of all the works of Peretz or something, but I'm interested in sort of the way memory works, and I look at that in sort of and I try to put contemporary or more recent historical events in a larger historical perspective. As for do I have any tricks to start me with writing? Honestly, I have 4 little kids, just having nobody vomiting on me at any given moment is really inspirational. So it's they are out of the house, I am at work. So I do not need any further inspiration than that. The only thing I did is I don't use wireless. That's my ritual. Turn that off and then get to work.
Okay, and let's thank Dara.
Thank you.